On the journey to 1 million eSPM in Factorio, the most important step is the acquisition of the legendary buildings and modules. The best path to acquiring the legendary buildings we want for the final MegaMegabase is strenuous, occasionally cursed, often annoying, and heavily RNG dependent. In this episode, I'm going to travel to each planet, set up processes to produce every legendary item we're going to need, and casually on the side, increase our eSPM by another order of magnitude. I'm starting where we left off last time, on Fulgora, and begin by stripping the whole place of epic and legendary quality module 3s and EM plants. I then immediately leave, because even if Fulgora is arguably the home of quality, the real seat of power is the fiery hellhole of Vulcanus. I head out into the boonies in search of a decent calcite patch, and in the process show why the handheld railgun earned the title of the Demolisher Shitstomper 5000. I shot some miners down on the calcite, and run the belt down to a decent sized open area nearer my base, which is where I'm going to try to process all of the non-planet specific legendary items. This starts by making a lot of good old molten iron and copper. Okay, so for those of you who don't have a foggy about quality or how it works, I'll give you a quick crash course. Every item has 5 quality tiers, starting with common, which is the default, and then going up through uncommon, rare, epic and legendary. When crafting an item, you can put quality modules into the crafting machine to add quality chance, which dictates the likelihood that a crafted item will be of an increased quality. Say the quality chance was 20% and you're using common ingredients, then if you craft 10 items, on average 2 of them will be uncommon. There is also a 10% chance of a further quality increase, which can stack multiple times. So if you crafted 1000 items, 2 will be epic, 18 will be rare, 180 will be uncommon, and the rest will come out as common. As you can see here, I've built a setup to make higher quality green circuits from common iron and copper, and you might notice that I haven't used any speed beacons, which is because speed modules actually confer a negative quality bonus. It won't decrease the quality of any higher quality items, but it will make you less likely to get a quality increase from a craft. Another important concept is that you can craft items using higher quality ingredients, which guarantees an output of that quality. For instance, I'm taking uncommon iron plates and copper cable off this belt, and feeding them into an EM plant crafting uncommon green circuits, which with the quality modules means we will always at least get an uncommon circuit, but will have a chance to upgrade to rare or higher. The final key to this whole process is here, where we're using recyclers to turn circuits of any quality back into the ingredients of that given quality. It only returns 25% of the items that were taken to craft the circuit, but we can actually put quality modules into the machine, which means when we recycle a circuit of a given quality, we actually have a chance to get ingredients back of a higher quality. This is great because usually you get that initial, say, 20% chance to get a higher quality item, and that's it, and you have to deal with lower quality items too. But using this system, we not only deal with the overflow of unnecessary low quality items, we also get to cheekily roll the dice again on a quality upgrade when we recycle the overflow. This works pretty well, and you can see it didn't even take that long to get a legendary green circuit. I had a play around with setting up this modular circuit heavy thing, which was meant to automatically upcycle items, but it didn't really turn out that well. That little green circuit setup was pretty useful for explaining how quality works, but I actually found a much better way to get the result we want, so I'd demolish it and start over. I start, paradoxically, with taking the quality modules out of the green circuit plants. Instead, putting productivity and speed modules in the whole thing. With that metric fuck ton of green circuits, I can make an imperial shit ton of red circuits. And I can combine them both with sulfuric acid to make just a normal amount of blue circuits. At the heart of all quality processes are of course recyclers, and I'm putting in some effort here to improve their throughput by pouring their outputs into a chest and using circuits to only pull items out of the chest if there's more than 16 of them, so that the output is always fully stacked. The next obvious step is to craft those products back into blue circuits, and I do also include a belt to remove overflow so it doesn't back up. Although as the buffers fill and the build stabilises, that should be less and less necessary. What's not obvious is my choice of modules for the EM plants, because rather than the obvious choice of quality modules, I've gone with productivity modules. This might seem like a poor choice, since we're essentially halving our rate of quality upgrades, but something interesting happens with items like blue circuits where we can get the productivity to absurd values. If we reach level 13 blue circuit productivity, so plus 130% productivity, add on the 50% from the EM plants, and finally 125% from 5 legendary productivity modules, which we'll get soon, that comes out to 305% productivity, although there is a cap on all items at 300%, so actually 300% productivity. Since recyclers return a quarter of the ingredients of whatever you put in, and the EM plants now produce 4 times the products of whatever ingredients you put in, these now cancel out, and recycling the circuits loses no material, whilst still having a chance to upgrade the quality. In simple terms, the amount of common blue circuits we put in will be equal to the number of legendary blue circuits we pull out. It's not going to operate at full capacity until we set up legendary productivity 3 modules and finish researching blue circuit productivity level 13. But for now it can still chug along, suboptimally producing legendary blue circuits. Elsewhere, I've launched a new space platform, Casino Royale. That's right, for this video we're naming the platforms after Bond films. My initial plan for this one was a typical one and done ship that I could copy as many times as necessary, but I actually think its mysterious and important purpose is more fitting of a modular, expandable build. I start off with this engine block, and then it's time to work on what we're putting on top of it. I've put down these crushers, whose purpose I'll explain momentarily, but right at the front of the ship I'm putting a massive block of solar panels, and then laser turrets? You might think I've gone insane, but at the velocities this ship will be operating at, and of course with a decent level of damage upgrades, they can more than keep up, and it saves with the complexity of making ammo. Taking it for a test flight, the laser turrets absolutely flatline my power grid, but against all odds still manage to defend the platform decently well. The only real solution is more power, and rather than making the ship even taller, I decided to set up quality solar panels on Vulcanus using the same design I was previously using for quality on Fulgora. Okay, so now I'll explain what that massive array of crushers is for. The Asteroid reprocessing recipes in crushers are used to turn asteroid chunks randomly either back into themselves or into another type of chunk. My plan is to put quality modules into this process so that every time an asteroid is reprocessed we get a chance to upgrade its quality. The first big loop reprocesses common chunks, with any greater qualities being pulled off the sushi belt onto a loop that reprocesses uncommon chunks. And rinse and repeat until we're left with legendary chunks which can be crushed into legendary iron, copper, carbon, sulfur, calcite and ice. After a few more test flights, I more than half the number of laser turrets and add some more accumulators to try and solve the power issue, but it's still not enough. I'm not really that worried however, since as we copy more modules the ratio of useful solar panel containing space to useless dead space outside the ship that the laser turrets cover will decrease, so power will be less and less of a problem. All the legendary products come out through a belt in the middle, and are run past some filtered inserters which have the items the hub has less than 500 of whitelisted. Here's the true beauty of this design. As soon as it's not enough, we just copy and paste a new one, and once the equipment's been shipped up, it just works. A soft side goal I have for this episode is to get an unstacked green belt of each science pack, starting here with green science. That's 3600 packs per minute, which by the end of the episode with legendary prod modules and a good few more research productivity levels will come out to something in the ballpark of 36,000 eSPM. Nice. I also set up red science, although it's waiting on a few beacons to craft so won't be at full tilt yet. By now, enough legendary blue circuits have crafted that I can start to recycle the excess, giving us access to legendary red and green circuits. In other news, I can combine the legendary carbon and sulfur from Casino Royale with water to make legendary coal, which we can immediately turn into legendary plastic. Legendary calcite can be turned into legendary stone using the molten metal from lava recipe, although I really should have used lava to copper because that actually gives more stone. Finally, legendary iron and copper ore can just be smelted straight into legendary iron and copper plates. To my knowledge, there is no purpose for legendary ice, unless we want to ship it over to Aquilo and make legendary cryo science for some reason. Now we've roughly automated the main conventional resources, my next task is legendary Homium, since we need it to mass produce legendary tier 3 quality modules. I run out into the wilderness of Fulgara to find an appropriate site to set it up, and find one not only nearby, but actually on the same island as my main base. The first step is setting up some train stations to bring scrap in. Unfortunately, there's two very rich scrap islands nearby, so resources are in no short supply. I'm then processing the scrap directly into active provider chests, using quality modules in the process to try and roll for some higher quality items, to make the climb up to legendary not as steep when we get to the main legendary Homium production loop. When it comes to making Homium solution, you can't have quality fluids, which means that we need a different chemical plant for every quality of Homium ore we get, but all of the output can go into the same pipe. We also need a different machine for every quality of ice, even though it all just turns into water. I don't know how feasible this is, but I think it would be good if the developers made it so recipes like these that only produce qualityless fluids could take ingredients of any quality. Turning the Homium solution into plates, you can only craft common items if the ingredients are all fluid, so I put quality modules in that too to gamble them up. I set up a quality upcycler for EM plants over here, as well as the item trasher you can see below it. It works just like the old one, where it requests items which the robot network has more than a certain threshold of, and recycles them to stop anything clogging up the system. But this time it has quality modules, so even when we're breaking stuff down, we're still rolling that dice. I make refined concrete for the EM plants, which again, we need a different machine for every single quality. And finally, we can start to produce EM plants. You might wonder then, how do I plan to use all of this to get legendary Homium? Surely not from the trick I get from the foundries. The answer is simple. EM plants take Homium plate to craft, so if we can upcycle enough of them to legendary, we can recycle those EM plants into some of the legendary Homium we want. We're getting two for the price of one, really. The legendary EM plants we'll need for the final MegaMegabase, and the legendary Homium we're going to need for a few of different uses. Legendary quality modules chief among them. I expand to a second upcycling setup to hopefully improve production, although we're more likely to have an ingredient shortage than any issue with crafting speed. Back on Vulcanus, I'm setting up a legendary quality 2 modules, as it turns out they're the second best quality module after the legendary tier 3s, even better than epic tier 3s. Next up is a legendary productivity modules, which you might recall we need to make the most out of a legendary blue circuit build. To get the legendary eggs that requires, I'm using this dead simple system which shots all the eggs on a loop and just continuously recycles any non-legendary ones until only legendary ones remain. This simplicity leads to inefficiency, as it takes more than 1,000 common eggs to make one legendary one. So the smart thing to do would have been to set this up on Nalvis and just ship the legendary ones over. But when do I ever do the smart thing? Meanwhile on Fulgora, I've set up rocket fuel and rockets for our legendary Homium production. One of these rocket silos is for the legendary Homium itself, and the other is for the legendary EM plants. The major bottleneck for legendary modules right now is red circuits, since they only come from breaking down blue circuits. So I set up this machine which makes legendary red circuits if we're short on them, and have an excess of the ingredients. By now, I've expanded Casino Royale enough that the power issues are resolved, even with that big chunk of solar panels waiting to be constructed there. We've also started to get a few legendary productivity modules crafting, and being only a few levels away from Blue Circuit Productivity 13, we'll soon have our 1-to-1 common to legendary Blue Circuit build completed. Over on Nalvis, I'm feeling a bit cramped in my tiny little cookbox, so I finally finished that massive perimeter I started building. That's all so I can set up some much larger egg production. This one keeps the eggs in the nests so they don't start spoiling until a platform requests eggs, and then burns off any that were left on the belt and in the silos once the platform leaves and the request is no longer present. I really want to be able to research silly levels of mining productivity to make later processes easier, so I start setting up 3600 SPM Blue Science next. Naturally, the number of buildings needed to craft enough sulfur is comically small for such a big number. If you think that's bad, wait until we start playing with legendary buildings. I quickly realised that the setup I copied from Green Science for Blue Science production was only made for 2 inputs, and so therefore wouldn't work, so I needed to redesign to fit 3 inputs instead. Engines can also use that same design, and thanks to how overpowered foundries are, we need surprisingly few buildings to feed the massive stack. I came up with this pretty nice design for red circuits, which can be fed by a pretty small green circuit build, and feed straight into the science build, completing our target of 3600 SPM. And then I made purple science. Yeah, I forgot to unpause OBS. What are you going to do about it? Thankfully, I took the time to show off the whole thing afterwards, once I realised. It's built for 3600 SPM, just like the rest, but funnily enough we can't actually sustain that yet, because all the stone comes from making molten metal, and we don't quite use enough molten metal to make enough stone to fully saturate purple science. Although by the time the rest of the sciences are set up later, we most certainly will. The next thing I want is legendary tungsten, which I really don't have a good solution for. As you can see, we're starting off with some quality moduled miners, loading onto a train, where I'm using this very over-engineered thing with a rocket silo to upcycle it using the same idea as with the biter eggs. Since we're already getting legendary carbon from space, we can use this to make legendary tungsten carbide for foundries, big miners and speed module 3s. Elsewhere, I've found a way to turn molten iron and copper directly into legendary steel and copper plate. And no, you can't just set the casting recipe in a foundry to be a higher quality. That would be too easy. Once I get LDS productivity to level 15, then we get into the same situation as with blue circuits, where we can recycle LDS back into the same amount of ingredients as it takes to craft one. That means I can use the legendary LDS casting recipe, which takes in legendary plastic and both molten metals, then scrap the legendary LDS that produces, which gives us back all the plastic we used to craft it, as well as a legendary steel and copper, since scrapping returns the output of the default recipe. With most basic legendary resources automated, I get started on my legendary mall, where I'll be making most legendary buildings. I've started off with Asteroid collectors, since they get the most benefit of any building from higher quality, and Crushers, since one of the first big uses for all of our legendary stuff will be better space platforms. It's not long before I've got a decent little mall going. There are very few legendary buildings which I can't automate with the materials I have automated now, although producing them at any great scale will still be an issue. In other news though, the legendary blue circuit build finally has all of the productivity modules it needs, so it's converting common to legendary 1-to-1, even if it's not at the greatest pace. Fulgora has also produced a whopping 164 legendary Homium, and I can reduce the launch threshold so that we don't have to wait right up until 1,000 accumulate every time before some get launched. 164 might not sound like a lot, but each plate can be turned into 6 legendary quality module 3s. So that right there is going to get us 984 legendary quality module 3s. It's time now to send up our next space platform, Goldfinger. The general idea for this one is to supersede our first generation inner planet haulers, the Citron C1s, with something much faster, since we've got a lot more science to move around now. These legendary cargo bays have twice the capacity of the common ones, so even if our cargo bay ends up looking small, there's a good chance it'll still be competitive. The legendary thrusters are also great because they effectively act as 2.5 common thrusters, but without the added width that would confer, so it allows the platform to go much faster. After a lot of fiddling around, I end up with something a bit like this, and then immediately decide I hate it and destroy it. The truth is, symmetry is overrated. So after I've placed the cargo bays down, I immediately place down this wonky nuclear power plant. Although this is a smaller power plant than that of the Citron C1s, that's fine because even though legendary buildings get a 2.5 times stats boost, they don't actually require any more power, so you get a lot more done with a lot less power demand. At the front of the platform, I'm obviously using legendary collectors to maximise resources gathered, but for the gun turrets I'm actually only using common, since all legendary does is increase range, and with damage upgrades as high as mine are, that just means we waste more ammo shooting asteroids out to right or left, which have no chance of ever hitting the platform. All the asteroids feed onto this loop, which uses circuits to reprocess any asteroids we have too many of. Below that there are the actual asteroid processing crushers, and then the ammo, fuel and oxidizer production. Thanks to the power of legendaries, even this tiny setup can make 10 yellow ammo per second, which should be far more than I need. I very messily managed to bend the ammo belt down to the very bottom of the ship, where this singular gun turret will protect the thrusters and sides of the ship whilst it's stationary in orbit. Although preferably, it would never be stationary enough for that to be an issue. The only advanced asteroid crushing recipe I actually need is calcite, so I have this circuit which changes the ice crusher to that advanced recipe when we need more calcite, and to the basic if we have enough. I think that should be about right, so it's time to send it off on a test flight and see how it fares. Despite some impressive acceleration, it almost immediately flounders due to a lack of calcite, although that's more than expected due to the low spawn rate of oxide asteroids around these parts. It continues to fluctuate heavily even towards the end of the trip, although the results are impressive. It's on the return trip that it shines, as now that the buffers have been filled, it's hitting nearly 500 kilometers a second. Fast enough to go from one planet to another in around 30 seconds. Soon enough, I'm confident enough to set its requests so that it can begin transporting science from Vulcanus to Nalvis. To make the most out of its extreme speed, I'll end up giving each inner planet one, but for now, I'll let Citron C1 deal with Fulgora and Glaber for us. Obviously the old lab setup on Nalvis won't be able to handle us increasing SPM by a factor of 10, so I set to work on a new design. The final million eSPM design will probably need to use belts for practicality reasons, but I don't see why we can't indulge with bots for just this episode to speed things along and save that design for next time. Back on Vulcanus, I built a much bigger blue circuit upcycling setup, since the original one was pretty slow, and realistically we've got the supply to handle a setup even 100 times bigger than this one. Back on Nalvis, that old nuclear plant isn't nearly enough to keep up with the new science setup and all the robots it requires, so I built a 4x4 reactor which I can copy as many times as needed going forward to keep up. Soon, Nalvis is going to become very important, and we'll need to launch a lot of rockets, so it doesn't make sense for it to get all of its rocket parts from Vulcanus, especially since with our quickly ballooning mining productivity levels, mined resources are going to be functionally infinite. Big mining drills automatically produce full stacks of resources, meaning these single belts of ore are as good as 4 unstacked belts. I combined the ore with calcite, which we unfortunately do still need to import from Vulcanus, to make molten metal. I then turned that into green circuits and then red circuits, the plastic for which coming from this oil build I just put together. The blue circuits are up next. After all of the work with quality I've been doing, making just common items feels almost too easy. I copied down 2 more 4x4 reactors, and rather than wait for all of those buildings to get shipped over from Vulcanus, I automated everything but the reactor locally. I also put those circuits I set up to use on this. A big array of Productivity Module 3 upcyclers, which will from now on be our main source of legendary Productivity 3 modules. It's essentially just a higher throughput version of the ones I set up on Fulgora, where we're crafting a load of Productivity 3 modules of quality, recycling all non-legendary ones of quality, and recrafting all the different quality ingredients into modules until they've been upgraded to legendary. Over on Vulcanus, I've set up a legendary big miners, next to the legendary foundries I forgot to mention I built earlier, but were used to build Goldfinger. Then, on Aquilo, it's time for the very anticlimactic creation of legendary lithium. Since the lithium crafting recipe takes Homium plate and then 2 fluids, all we need to do is send over legendary Homium plate and we can turn it straight into legendary lithium. Legendary lithium is only really useful for legendary cryo plants, unless you want to combine it with legendary ice for legendary cryo science for some reason, which also requires legendary reinforced concrete, so I set up a decent supply on Vulcanus for me to ship over. Funnily enough, I know I've been crafting legendary foundries up to this point, but I don't know where the legendary reinforced concrete came from for that. It doesn't take long after that for a few legendary cryo plants to accumulate, which I'll need for my next new platform when I get to that. The next 4 hours of footage are completely gone. When I try to look at it in VLC, it's just the same frozen frame for 4 hours and 8 minutes. So we're picking up in media res as I'm upgrading Glaber. In that time, I set up this admittedly not very good carbon fibre build, which processes Umicore into mash and lets some of it spoiled turn into carbon and combines the rest with that carbon to make the carbon fibre. I also set up overgrowth soil by combining each artificial soil with biter eggs, spoilage, water and its respective fruit seed. This soil allows us to plant fruit anywhere in its respective biome, not just in the fertile soil and swamp. After an artillery range upgrade, a massive attack wave to the south knocked out 2 entire Agri science modules, which is totally not annoying. Back on Vulcanus quickly, here's 3600 SPM of yellow science, using all legendary buildings and modules. I'm not joking, it genuinely is that small. I launched up a new platform, Thunderball, which I initially planned to be my space science ship before I found a better solution. Don't worry, I will find a use for it later. My better solution for space science was to just stick it onto the end of Casino Royale, since it's constantly going back and forth between Vulcanus and Nalvis anyway. Making yellow science used up all of my accumulated legendary productivity 3 modules, but once a few more have crafted, they'll get sent up to finish it off. Those of you paying attention to the platform list will have noticed Skyfall appear a few clips ago. This is my mid-game Aquilo platform I made using legendary buildings and modules, the construction of which was unfortunately another victim of the loss of 4 hours of footage. So I recorded a little once-over so you can see it now. Back on Vulcanus again, I set up 3600 SPM of military science, to make the stone for which I'm just making an absolute fuck ton of molten copper and force pumping it into the overall system. Cheese haters, cover your eyes and ears now. I'm not quite getting rid of molten copper fast enough, so I make this setup to void it. Basically, I use circuits to set the LDS recipe in those foundries for a frame at a time every few frames, which under normal circumstances would cause the fluid to backflow into the pipe. But, due to the pumps running into the foundries, there's nowhere for the fluid to go, so it just gets deleted. This section was meant to be all about Glaber, so I'll get back over there now. The next legendary product I want is highly atypical, starting here with creating nutrients from bioflux and immediately recycling it into spoilage with quality. It then goes on to this circular belt which takes the common spoilage, crafts it into nutrients with quality, and then immediately recycles that back into spoilage with quality. Similar to what we did with Asteroid processing, the uncommon spoilage is passed on to another loop which does the same thing, except with uncommon nutrients. Then rare, rinse and repeat until we're left with the mythical and much sought after legendary rot. The next step in my nefarious plan is this setup, which creates pentapod eggs and upcycles them using recyclers, like I did with biter eggs, until we get a legendary pentapod egg. This culminates in this setup, which crafts our legendary spoilage into legendary nutrients to breed legendary pentapod eggs and use those to craft legendary biochambers. To prevent the system using legendary nutrients as fuel, all the legendary nutrient inserters aiming into biochambers can only insert if the target biochamber has common nutrients in its inventory. As it turns out, we weren't quite making enough legendary spoilage to support the egg breeding, so I designed this module which uses chests, stack inserters and circuits to ensure that only full stacks are placed onto the belt and make a much bigger upcycling setup. Now that I've got legendary biochambers, I can do what I came here to do and set up my 3600 SPM of Agri science, starting by running off into the boonies so I have enough room and farmland. Once there, I set up this little artillery outpost so that I can clear out the local area of any potential spore huffers. It's not long before some Boy Scouts come a-knocking, and we get here our first look at some of the higher evolution pentapods. Overgrowth soil production is very closely linked to how much of that biome's fruit you use, since you need seeds from processing it to make the soil. Since jelly nut is used a lot less than Yumiko, I place my jelly nut production straight onto fertile land, so I can just use regular purple artificial soil and don't need to wait 5 to 10 business decades for enough purple overgrowth to produce. Legendary biochambers with legendary modules are insane in practice, as this setup with only 3 buildings provides enough bioflux for about 10,000 SPM of agri-science. The biggest problem at this scale is moving items between machines fast enough, as we need to put almost 200 Yumiko mash and almost 150 jelly into the bioflux machine every second. That requires 3 full legendary bulk inserters to move. Then it needs at least 4 rare stack inserters to get the 120 bioflux a second out, since I haven't set up the legendary ones yet, and rare is the highest I can reasonably gamble for. We then need to put the nutrients in and take any spoilage out, and with 1 inserter for each, that brings us to 12 inserters coming in or out of this machine. Of the 12 non-long inserters we could possibly fit. The Yumiko farm required for this is gargantuan, and there's not enough fertile land around to avoid using overgrowth soil. A very large amount of construction bot missing warnings from Nalvis alerts me to something suspicious, which upon investigation turns out to be a thoroughly overfilled landing pad, which is now spilling items out all over the ground. Nothing a few legendary cargo bays won't fix, I suppose, but there really should be a warning if you're requesting more items than your landing pad can hold. With that slowly resolving itself in the background, I bring my attention back to Glaber, where I'm spitballing my Agri science modules. Literally everything is made of bioflux, so I've solved most of the problem already, and just need to make a load of nutrients to feed egg breeding, the excess from which I combine with more bioflux to make that yummy Agri science. We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming for something which is not a sponsor. Kind of. As it turns out, you guys are pretty cool, so when I set a goal on my Ko-Fi to pretty please get 185 crisp pound sterling to upgrade my shit-ass 13-year-old computer so I might actually finish this series, I expected to hit the target in a few weeks, but instead had it quadrupled in a day. I was very happy. Here's a picture of all the new computery bits, and here's me thanking everyone who donated to meet and exceed the goal from the bottom of my heart. We now return to your regularly scheduled and newly performance drop free programming. Even though green overgrowth soil produces much faster owing to us using more Umicore, we also need a lot more of it, again because we use more Umicore. For this reason, I set up some Umicore farms on a small patch of fertile dirt to at least allow the setup to start working before all the overgrowth soil has been crafted. I then decided that since I had such a gargantuan bioflux production, I might as well just double up the science production to 7200 SPM to offset any loss from spoilage, as well as the fact that this science cannot be buffered. Over on Aquilo, I'm combining stone, carbon fibre, tungsten plate, lithium and cold fluoroketone to make foundation. And although it just looks like fancy landfill, it's actually very important because it allows us to build over Vulcanus' lava and Fulgora's oil ocean. It is, however, prohibitively expensive, so it doesn't entirely trivialise those planet space constraints, but it allows us to take a few shortcuts on Vulcanus and completely changes how we think about power on Fulgora. I'm setting up upcycling of tool belts on Glaber, not because I'm particularly bothered about my inventory space, most work is done by bots at this point anyway, but because it's a pretty surefire way to get legendary carbon fibre, which I want for legendary stack inserters. That's not even the most problematic ingredient, however, since they also need legendary jelly, which is difficult due to its transience. It's not good enough to simply stockpile legendaries when they'll spoil after 10 minutes. We need to have a steady and consistent supply, which I support by making a fuck ton of jelly and recycling it with quality until the few legendaries remain. Even this might not be enough. The next science on Santa's list that's been a good boy and is therefore getting gruesomely distended for Christmas is EM science. Trust me, it does not go easily. As you can see, I'm making use of Foundation to connect the chosen island up to my existing power grid, saving all the fuss about finding an island with enough space to make enough power and enough production. I'm also foregoing the free power of Fulgora for the practically unlimited power of fusion, since why harness the power of a planet when you can harness the power of the sun? When all the equipment comes, anyway. For the actual EM science production, I ended up with this. Buffers aren't really something I used on the other science builds, but they're actually pretty important because space logistics is discrete, not continuous. The platforms are only there for a very small amount of time, and therefore the buffer allows the setup to function non-stop rather than getting backed up whilst the platform's off delivering. I'm immediately struck by a wall of what's essentially logistical writer's block. There's so much to set up for this science pack, and it's hard to know where to start. When built at scale, and without bots, EM science goes from being one of the easiest sciences to set up to the hardest by a country mile. Fulgora simply does not do volume, but to get the level of science production we want, it is volume we must produce. In an effort to simplify the scrap handling area, I make the decision to deliver gears to the accumulator crafting and recycle them into iron on site. It doesn't seem like much, but when you see the hell I go through with scrap sorting soon, it's well appreciated. Once I've got my ingredient crafting mostly locked in, it's time to delve down that dark path. My first idea is these scrap recycling sushi belts, which, if anything, proves I wasn't paying any attention to the throughput requirements, because I'm trying to cram the 4 stacked belts of throughput I need onto 1 belt. Time to say bye bye to that then. Here's idea 2, which is again not even worth talking about because I still haven't bothered to check the actual throughput requirements of this thing. I'm then interrupted, mid-ponder, by an alert that Goldfinger got destroyed by biters. It turns out that because science was backed up waiting on cryogenic packs, Goldfinger never dropped off any science packs at Nalvis, and therefore on return to Vulcanus, wouldn't even stop since its conditions were already met, leading to it not dropping the biter eggs for that old prod module setup, which led to them spoiling and eating the platform hub. I added a wait condition to fix that, but as soon as those very nearly spoiled eggs touched down on Vulcanus, they started hatching as the bots were taking them to the upcycling setup, leading to this mess. Since Vulcanus has no pollution, there's nothing actually incentivising them to attack, so it's not either going to rip the whole planet apart, but they are doing dredges of damage as they target onto turrets, so I leave a healthy spread of laser turrets to whittle them down in the background. Even better though, some of the eggs I put into the trash slots on Goldfinger got shot down to Nalvis, where there is no turrets around the landing pad, so it got fucking eaten. Tens of thousands of every type of science pack, as well as a good few legendary buildings, gone in the blink of an eye. Still cheaper than losing Goldfinger though, so I don't reload. Thankfully Citron C1 still had a landing pad on board, so I can shoot it down to replace the old one. By far the funniest bit of Rube Goldberg fuckery this caused was here though, where due to having no landing pad, the biter nests haven't been getting any bioflux and therefore broke free. Although the previously captured nests are blacklisted from getting shot by turrets, the biters they spawn are not, and the flamethrowers from the original perimeter have been barbecuing the biters and burning down the nests with the AoE damage. Anyway, we were meant to be working on Fulgora. I yet again destroyed the scrap setup, although you can see it did manage to make a bit of EM science, which is getting launched up. Just far from enough for it to satisfy 3600 SPM. Attempt 3, I at least made 2 lanes of scrap product throughput, but it still isn't enough, so it too must go. My next plan involves making multiple smaller modules that handle maybe a fully stacked belt of scrap, and then copying it 3 more times to get the 4 stacked belts we need. You can see here, I'm recycling directly into a cargo wagon with filtered slots, which is much more compact than using splitters to separate it all out. My plan is to void all the high throughput items individually for maximum efficiency, such as recycling excess gears into iron plates and then crafting and recycling chests to get rid of them as fast as possible. The same can be done for concrete by crafting and recycling hazard concrete, and for steel by crafting and recycling steel chests. I tried to get rid of the rest by just dumping it into 2 recyclers aiming into each other, because at this point I didn't quite realise how silly an idea that was. After that almost immediately backed up, I used a looping belt instead, which pulled items off to recycle and dumped the product back on. That worked for a while, so I copied the whole thing 4 times to get the throughput I needed. To decompress from what was becoming a very frustrating build, I turned my focus to Glaber for a moment to set up this very nice carbon fibre build. Rather than waiting for mash to spoil to turn into carbon, this recycles nutrients for spoilage to make it, which speeds up the process massively. Back to hell, using foundation I can bring in 4 stacked belts of scrap from another island. You might complain that this isn't heckin' wholesome modular, because the scrap mines will eventually run out, but I've got like 120 mining productivity levels at this point, so that won't be an issue this century. The scrap processing itself needs a decent amount of legendary stack inserters, so I set up direct upcycling for them on Glaber to assault the problem on two fronts. Anyway, who'd have guessed it, but those recycling loops have backed up, so I attached two auxiliary setups on the top, which obviously does nothing to solve the issue. So it's time for redesign 5? Right, we're going back to basics with this one. Every different item will have its own dedicated recycling setup, which will be specifically designed to destroy it as quickly and space efficiently as possible. Stone and Homium can't be crafted into anything on their own, so they just get two recyclers running into each other, but red circuits is more involved, starting of course with recycling them. I then destroy the copper wire by recycling it into plate and crafting it back into copper repeatedly. Plastic bars can be recycled back into themselves in a loop, and the green circuits are getting recycled in the same machine as the green circuits from the blue circuits, the copper wire being put into the same loop which gets rid of the copper wire from red circuits. Iron plates are then just recycled into themselves for space efficiency, as I'm trying to keep this all in the same width footprint. There are far too many moving parts in this to talk through the whole thing in that much detail, but here's an overview of the complete thing, which still didn't work. It turns out I'd forgotten to deal with batteries, but that's easily fixed. At this point we still aren't getting 3600 SPM, and I don't quite know why. We have enough recyclers on scrap, nothing's backed up. What's happening? I actually solved this issue while messing around off camera, but as it turns out, if we only have one inserter feeding into the recyclers, they actually weren't getting enough material in. But since everything moves so fast, it's not obvious looking at the animations on the machine, only when actually in the crafting menu. Those few frames that the machine is empty at a time actually meant the machine was only working like 70% of the time, which is why we weren't reaching 3600 SPM. It works great now. With that held complete, I'm free to get back to work on some nicer projects, such as this massive egg extraction facility on Nalvese I'm going to use to boost my legendary Prod 3 production, as well as later on use for making legendary biolabs. This thing makes an unstacked belt of eggs, which we're then upcycling to hopefully get a few dozen legendary eggs an hour. All the rest of the ingredients are of course just coming from Vulcanus, and I got very optimistic with the level of Prod 3 production we're actually going to be able to do here. There's very few legendary resources or buildings left for me to set up, so I focus on getting cryogenic science up to 3600 SPM. This should, I hope, be a pretty easy one, besides the whole heating gimmick of Aquilo. Thanks to the amount of module slots cryo plants have, along with the multiplicative effect of productivity and speed modules, this is all the production we need for cryo science, which generally has one of the longer crafting times of all the science packs. This is all going to need a lot more power than that little fusion reactor can provide, so I built a slightly larger one to tide us over. Lithium is a doozy thanks to the power of productivity, and with these legendary buildings there are very few ingredients we're going to need more than one crafting machine for here. There's not much new with this build compared to the smaller one I already have, except for the fact that in the absence of my big ice platform and rocket fuel build to balance my ammonia production, I'm simply voiding any excess using the same process I had to void molten copper from military science. I got myself in a bit of a mess here because I forgot that hot fluoroketone wants raw lithium, not the smelted stuff. So I needed to do some shenanigans to make that fit, which is harder than you might expect when everything needs a heat pipe next to it. All that's left then is to connect up new outposts for lithium brine and fluorine. Once I've weeded out a few minor issues, we're soon printing out cryo science like it's nobody's business. At the other end of the temperature spectrum, I head back to Vulcanus to set up 3600 SPM of metallurgic science packs. Metallurgic science is even more of a runt than cryo science, being very simple to make and having absolutely nothing interesting about it at all. I've actually got a pretty big shortage of legendary tungsten carbide for the foundries and speed 3 modules. So similar to what I did with eggs on Nalvis, I set up a massive tungsten mine, and then threw the ore in the thousands into recyclers to skim a few legendary tungsten off to boost production. The reason for the tungsten shortage is because in space, shit's getting real, as I'm standing up the space platform Spectre, which will be our new Prometheium science ship. Unlike last time, I'm going to try to match Prometheium science production to the rest of the science packs, which is not an easy task. Of course, at the centre of it all is the science production itself. The crafting speed for Prometheium science is insane, so these 2 machines are more than enough. The issue is putting enough chunks into the machines to sustain it. Those Tesla turrets around the machine are there in case any eggs hatch mid-flight, because rather than cheese Prometheium collection like on the Yaris, we're going to do it the intended way on Spectre. I start off with yellow ammo because that's the easiest. You could very easily argue for using red ammo on a ship like this, but I'm not going to because a later design choice makes gun turrets nearly useless. Next up is coal synthesis and explosives, although I appear to have forgotten to set the recipe on the Cryo plants. Combining the explosives with iron plate gets us rockets, and I'm actually combining those rockets with more explosives to get explosive rockets. More on that later. Last of all is railgun ammo. This might not look like a massive amount of production, but given the number of railguns you can actually fit on a platform of this width, remember we can't double them up because they destroy anything they shoot through, this is enough production to accommodate for many shooting speed upgrades to come. Routing iron and copper ore ends up being a humongous pain in the arse in this little space, since we need slightly more than half a belt of iron ore, so I need to fiddle around getting 2 belts in this gap, but I make it work before I realised I forgot to account for the asteroids coming out of the process. Rather than rebuild the outputs, I turn the input belt into a loop and use circuits to control when more metallic asteroid chunks can be added on, as to not back it all up. I had the same issue with oxide crushing, having built it before that epiphany, so I just used the circuit to only let asteroid chunks in when they were non-buffered in front of the crusher. I had no major issues with carbonic since I built it after I had that epiphany, and to balance them all I used a similar system to that aboard Casino Royale, just without the quality modules. The nose of this platform is an absolute mess. You can see the 4 belts which form that artery you might have noticed running through the ship, which is there to escort Prometheium asteroid chunks directly from the asteroid collectors towards science production. All the other chunk types are just dumped into the reprocessing loop and sorted out of it to their respective locations, which might seem crude for such a high throughput ship, but with such high productivity from modules in the ammo crafting, and from asteroid processing productivity research, we really don't use many chunks. It's a surprisingly short time before enough fuel and ammo have accumulated for me to send Spectre out to gather resources and fill its buffers. It has remarkably few gun turrets since most DPS will rely on the explosive rockets, which means that funnily enough it's quite weak in the inner planet space, although it does just about scrape by. I did experiment for a while with letting the rocket turrets target medium asteroids directly, but that causes this to happen since the rockets can and will friendly fire, which is obviously not ideal. I set up legendary rocket turrets on Glaber since the further away the rockets can find their target, the less likely they are to shoot when it's nearby. So along with just limiting the rocket turrets to shooting big asteroids, our friendly fire problem should be fixed. I'm attending to something or another on Nalvis when a ton of destroyed alerts come through. I presumably wasn't wearing headphones at the time, so I was none the wiser, but we will find the source of it soon. Regardless, Spectre soon reaches the solar system edge for the first time, and we can see how it holds up in interstellar space. Honestly, for a while, I was confident it might be able to hold full speed all the way out, but alas, it starts letting through asteroids, so I'm going to need to set up some sort of throttling system. In other news, here's the source of those alerts. It chose a good time to die when its successor was in the final stages of development. Anyway, I got to work on that throttling system for Spectre. Oh, not this again. I'm not even sure how it happened this time, so I'm going to just pray that it was a fluke and doesn't happen again. With the exploding problem solved by just making it slow down a bit when it's heading towards the shattered planet, my new issue is that it just cannot collect enough Prometheium chunks. The new design I came up with looked like this. It's got more collectors, more railguns, more rockets and more gun turrets. Better in every conceivable way. Testing it out in deep space, you can see it doesn't even blink at the onslaught of asteroids. I do still think I can push it a bit further though. As it turns out, if you go far enough back behind a thruster, you are eventually able to build again, and I can use this to add a second stack of thrusters behind the first ones. With this adjustment, it can now hit around 600 km a second whilst inside the star system, which increases the number of eggs it can carry, since it can gather more Prometheium before they spoil, which is effectively our biggest limiter at the moment. Meanwhile on Nalvis, the shadow government has legalised nuclear bombs, so I start upcycling them to get legendary Uranium-235 for legendary biolabs. As it turns out, that actually needs a lot of uranium, who'd have thunk it, so it's time to design a new high throughput uranium processing setup. It'll probably take a while for all the centrifuges to get sent over, because I wasn't anticipating ever needing more, and so haven't been making them since I initially set up Nalvis. I'm just brute forcing Corvarex again, since this thing is so high throughput, it won't even take that long for all the buffers to fill. Whilst it does, I set up CaptureBot upcycling, and since we can craft legendary labs easily from our legendary items on Vulcanus, and we already set up legendary reinforced concrete, the only thing separating us from legendary biolabs is time. It's worth noting we're still only getting uranium from this piddly little patch I set up 100 hours ago, so I'm doing something I've never done before and beaconing my miners. To save me importing robot frames from Vulcanus to make the capture bots, I put this little spaghetti build together near my circuit builds. Then, in an effort to improve the throughput of the new Corvarex build, I wanted to use stack inserters to output from the machines. But since most only have enough room for one stack inserter, and Corvarex has two outputs, this would very quickly deadlock as the stack inserter gets stuck trying to pick up one, whilst the other backs up. To fix this, I have this little circuit which usually keeps the stack size of the inserters at their default of 16, but every second or so changes it to 1, which forces all the inserters to drop what's in their hand, preventing deadlocks. It does technically decrease throughput as some inserters will drop partial stacks, but it's a massive improvement over using bulk inserters either way. I liked that first Corvarex setup so much, I made another one. I don't think we're going to have any Uranium-235 problems anytime soon. Also whilst I'm here, I built this expandable egg launching setup to supply Prometheium science. It's more in the vein of the first setups I built, but is far more easily expandable and slightly higher throughput. By now, I've pushed Spectre to carry 25,000 eggs out to the shattered planet, which it can turn into over 60,000 Prometheium science pack. This is about the limit for this platform, as the last few hundred eggs spoil, which the Tesla turrets handle alright, but means that if any more delays occur, the consequences could be deadly. On Nalvis, the first few legendary biolabs have crafted, so I can place them down to boost our already immense science consumption. On Vulcanus, I've built a new generation of legendary blue circuit production, which is basically the same as the other two, but it's impossible to back up and easily tileable. I'm going to make a controversial decision now, for the sake of UPS going forward. Since nuclear bombs are literally a dime a dozen at this point, biters no longer pose any threat besides to my performance. For this reason, I've decided to turn off biters in the map generation settings. The existing biters will remain, so we'll still have to kill them off, but it means that any newly generated terrain will no longer spawn them. And once I've put the work in and extinctionated them, then I'll be saving some UPS, which we're going to need for the final base. I have one final little redesign for Spectre, whereby installing these recessed asteroid collectors allows us to get more of the Prometheium chunks we were losing to the nose of the platform, without having to sacrifice any railguns. I've now finally found a use for Thunderball. as a carbon copy of Spectre. This design, on average, produces between 1800 and 2000 Prometheium science packs per minute, meaning that with 2 of them, that puts our Prometheium production on par with the production of all the other sciences, a feat I'm unlikely to be able to replicate for the final MegaMegabase. Watching these mega platforms in deep space, their serpentine arms splayed out like some sort of eldritch horror, is one of the most satisfying experiences Factorio has to offer. They exist on a knife's edge, however. I have to set up recycling for any excess Prometheium science because any backup would cause thousands of eggs to hatch on the platform, which would easily destroy it. So, as we close in on the end here, it's about time to reveal what the final eSPM for this episode is. From 3600 packs per minute, passed through biolabs with research productivity level 40 and legendary productivity 3 modules, we're coming out to a whopping 40,000 eSPM, which we'll call 36,000 to account for those little dips you can see on the graph. Between that, my sustainable production of just about every legendary building and module I'm ever going to want, and my newly upgraded PC, I think we're just about ready to take on the true final challenge. Next time. Thank you for watching the second part in my Factorio MegaMegabase series. I hope you stick around for the next part where I'm going to be pushing for the big 1 million eSPM. I want to make an extra special thank you to everyone who donated to help me upgrade my PC. I doubt the next part would be possible without that. And of course, a special thanks to my Ko-Fi supporters in supporting me in what I do. Stay silly.